It looked like the future, right up until it looked like the end of the world. May 6th, 1937, Lakehurst, New Jersey. It's early evening. The ground is damp, the sky is unsettled, and people are waiting for one of the most extraordinary machines ever built to come down out of the air. The Hindenburg is not just an aircraft, it's not just a big balloon. It's a floating palace, a silver giant, a symbol of engineering confidence so enormous that it seems to make ordinary airplanes look like impatient little insects. It's late, it's badly delayed by weather, and yet it's still capable of turning heads even from miles away. Hours earlier, it had drifted over Manhattan like a spectacle designed by someone with a flair for drama. That was wonderful to see in the 1930s. Now it's finally approaching. It's mooring. Here it is in Lakehurst, New Jersey. And people on the ground are watching what they expect will be a usual elegant landing. Instead, they're about to witness one of the most famous disasters in modern history. What makes the Hindenburg so fascinating is that it's not some clumsy experimental oddity in its very first nervous outing. This was a seasoned transatlantic passenger airship. It had already completed numerous crossings without any kind of signs of disaster. It was luxurious, comfortable, and in some ways more civilized than early airplane travel. Passengers could walk around, they could dine properly, they could sleep in relative comfort, and they could enjoy the slow, stately sensation of crossing an ocean in style. For all the jokes modern people might make about putting a hotel inside a gas bag, the experience was real, desirable, and prestigious. The Hindenburg was not a punchline before May 6th of 1937. It was a marvel. The ship had departed Frankfurt on May 3rd for the first American crossing in 1937 season. The flight across the Atlantic had been the most uneventful except for strong headwinds that had slowed its progress. By the time it reached the northeastern United States, it was already behind schedule. Then weather around Lakehurst forced more delays. Thunderstorms rolled in, and Captain Max Pruss, had to wait rather than bring the airship in under these poor conditions. So instead of going straight to the field, the Hindenburg lingered. It passed over Boston in the morning. It later swept over Manhattan, causing people in the streets below to stop and stare up at the thing. Then it moved along the New Jersey shore while waiting for the weather to clear. This was not a straight line to disaster. It was a long, frustrating, very public delay. But the delay matters because it made the final landing more awkward than people realize. This was now a ship arriving almost a half a day late, and everyone on board knew that the entire turnaround schedule had become tighter because of this. There was less time to service the airship and prepare it for the return flight. The atmosphere at Lakehurst was not one of calm ceremony. It was one of tired professionals trying to finish a complicated job after a day of interruptions. The landing method chosen was also important. This was to be a high landing, also known as a flying moor, where the airship would drop lines from a significant height and then be brought down to the mast manually. It reduced the number of ground crew that was needed, but it demanded precision and patience. At the exact wrong time, precision and patience were both in short supply. But this is where the details begin to matter and where the whole event starts to feel eerie in retrospect. At around 7 in the evening, the Hindenburg made its final approach. At one point, it had to make a sharp turn because the ground crew was not yet ready. Later, the wind shifted direction, forcing another sharp turn. Water ballasts was dropped in several stages because the airship's stern was heavy, but this caused a major problem. Gas was valved. Engines idled and then reversed, and 6 crewmen were sent into the bow to help adjust the trim because the tail was sitting too low. These were not the details that usually survive in popular memory, but they matter because they suggest that a ship under mild but growing strain was being coaxed into position by a crew that was making multiple adjustments in very quick succession. At 7:21 in the evening, the mooring lines were dropped. First the starboard line, then the port line. The port line was already pulled too tight. Some aboard felt a shock and assumed that a rope may have broken. A light rain had started to fall. On the ground, men began to grab the lines. In the air, some witnesses noticed something odd at the upper rear of the ship. Fabric near the tail seemed to flutter strangely. A few described seeing dim blue lights. Maybe it was static electricity, maybe it was St. Elmo's fire. Perhaps it was something else entirely. Not everyone saw the same thing, which is one reason the Hindenburg has remained such a fertile ground for argument. But enough people noticed something strange in the moments before the fire that the final seconds have never stopped being dissected, even now. At 7:25, the ship caught fire. It did not begin with the sort of gigantic cinematic fireball that people often imagine or remember seeing in the old black and white photos. It began near the rear upper section and then it spread with terrifying speed. In seconds, the stern became an inferno. The back of the ship lost its buoyancy and dropped toward the ground. That had to be absolutely terrifying for anybody on board. The bow rose into the air and the entire structure began to deform and then collapse in a way that looked both graceful and horrifying, like something huge trying to remain majestic while it was dying. Flames ran forward. The frame twisted. The skin burned away. Gas cells ignited. The gondola touched the ground, and the bow bounced slightly before the remaining structure came down. From the first visible fire to the final collapse, the destruction took only a matter of seconds. Depending on the estimate, the whole sequence lasted roughly half a minute. That is one of the cruelest parts of this story. For all its size and elegance, the end came faster than most people could ever understand. And yet within that speed were countless individual human experiences, each one different, each one shaped by a position, a chance, a timing. This is where the little-known details become especially haunting. Many of the crew who died were not in the visible passenger spaces at all. They were up inside the hull, especially near the bow, where escape routes were difficult anyway, and where the structure hung burning above the ground for just too long. The bow remained elevated as the rear collapsed, and for the men trapped in that section, the geometry of the disaster was fatal. They were not simply in a fire, they were in a burning structure suspended in the air. Passengers, too, experienced the fire very differently depending on where they were. The starboard side of the passenger area became far more dangerous than the port side. Wind pushed the flames in that direction, and as the ship rolled slightly to starboard, part of the structure collapsed outward, which trapped many of the people on that side. One sliding door jammed shut during the crash, cutting off a major escape path. On the port side, by contrast, many passengers got out with astonishing speed, some with only minor injuries. So survival on the Hindenburg was not evenly distributed by rage, angst, or courage, or gender, or anything like that. It was often just decided by which side of the ship that you happened to be occupying when the fire turned to an interior blaze in this maze. One of the strangest survival stories belongs to Werner Franz. He was a 14-year-old cabin boy. He was initially dazed by what was happening, and then a water tank burst above him, drenching the area and extinguishing the flames around him. Can you imagine that? There's a combination of terror and absurd luck. In the middle of a disaster that looks absolutely unsurvivable, a sudden burst of water created a pocket of safety. Franz found a hatch, dropped through it just at the right moment, nearly ran in the wrong direction into the wind-driven flames, corrected himself, and escaped, all without injury. It is one of those details that sounds invented because it's too neatly dramatic. And yet this happened. Sometimes survival is courage. Sometimes survival is instinct. Sometimes it's being in exactly the right place when something else breaks first. Another remarkable survivor story was an acrobat by the name of Joseph Spa. He was billed as Ben Dova. I'm not kidding. Bendova. When he realized the ship was in trouble, he smashed a window with his movie camera, lowered himself out, and hung from the ledge until the ship was close enough to the ground to make the drop survivable. He was injured, but he was able to get out. The image of this was almost surreal. An acrobat escaping a dying airship by improvising his own exit while holding on to a movie camera. It sounded like a film scene someone would reject for being too on the nose, of being way too unrealistic. But then there's Captain Max. I keep saying his name wrong. Then there's Captain Max Pruss himself, the commander of the Hindenburg on its final flight. He survived, but he was terribly burned. First Officer Albert Samt reportedly found Pruss trying to go back into the wreckage to look for survivors. That detail is often overshadowed by the scale of the fire itself, by the massive enormity of this disaster. But this was not simply a collapse followed by a stunned silence. Men ran toward the wreckage. Rescuers moved into this danger. Orders were shouted. The famous command from Chief Petty Officer Frederick Tobin, "Navy men stand fast," was not theatrical. This was practical, urgent, and necessary. Without that discipline, even more lives would have been lost. But this is one of the strangest and most misunderstood facts of the whole disaster. Herbert Morrison's famous radio cry, "Oh, the humanity," was not heard live by the public as it happened. Morrison and an engineer were recording the landing for delayed broadcast, essentially as an experiment. The recording was aired the next day. Later, his narration was synchronized with newsreel footage so effectively that generations came to believe they were hearing a live radio catastrophe in real time. The emotion was genuine, of course. The horror was genuine, but the public's first experience of that now iconic voice was slightly delayed and technologically reshaped. It was made to be more dramatic on purpose. One of the most famous moments in broadcast history is remembered as immediate when, in fact, it was already becoming a memory by the time most people even heard it. That matters because the Hindenburg was not just a disaster. This was a media event. There were multiple newsreel cameras teams on site. There were photographers in place, and enough public attention surrounding the landing that the destruction was preserved from many angles. Sam Shear took one of the most famous photographs by essentially shooting from the hip where the fire began. Murray Becker captured the moment flames burst from the nose. Spectators also photographed this wreck, and it was difficult to overstate how much that visual record shaped the public response. Other airship disasters had killed more people proportionally. Some had been deadlier in relation to those on board. But the Hindenburg died in front of cameras, and that gave it an afterlife almost as powerful as the event itself. The death toll itself was 36, 35 from the airship, and 1 ground crewman. 13 passengers and 22 crew members died aboard or shortly thereafter, with another fatality on the ground. Most died from burns, though some were killed from jumping from too great a height or by falling debris. It's also worth remembering that most survived. That sounds strange to say in a hydrogen in a disaster that's So infamous, but this matters. The very feature that made the hydrogen terrifying also made the fire somewhat different from a liquid fueled explosion. Hydrogen burns upward very rapidly. In some cases, that gave people an escape window. It was small, and savage as it was still an escape window. The hydrogen itself burned out in about 90 seconds, though diesel fuel continued to burn for so much longer. So the events looked apocalyptic, but for some people, the speed of the hydrogen fire paradoxically created the possibility of survival. Of course, the question that has never been fully disappeared is why it happened. This is where the Hindenburg stops being a clean tragedy and becomes an argument. Sabotage was one of the earliest theories. Some suspected a bomb, others suspected a political plot. Still others, a disgruntled passenger, a crew member. A number of suspects were floated over the years, including crewman Eric Spiel and passenger Joseph Spa. The sabotage theory makes for a compelling story, which is perhaps why it has survived so stubbornly in books, films, and conversations. But compelling it is not the same as convincing. No bomb fragments were ever found. No clear proof ever surfaced. The official investigation did not endorse sabotage, and most historians today treat it with deep skepticism. A more widely accepted theory centers on static electricity and leaking hydrogen. According to this view, the Hindenburg passed through unstable weather, accumulated electrical charge, and during the landing process, it developed a dangerous potential difference between its skin and the frame. If hydrogen had leaked near the stern, a static spark could have ignited it. This theory has a grim sort of elegance because it ties together so many strange things. The weather delay, the rain, the mooring lines, the blue glow some people witnessed describing, and the possible fluttering fabric near the tail. Modern experiments and reanalysts have continued to keep this theory alive because it remains plausible and because it does not require conspiracies or dramatic hidden sabotage. But there are other theories also. Some have argued that the fabric coating on the Hindenburg was dangerously flammable and contributed heavily to the speed of the fire. Others say the fire may have begun with structural failure in the stern, perhaps from accumulated stress, a snapping bracing wire, or rupture in one of the gas cells. A few have even suggested engine sparks or fuel leaks. The frustrating truth is that the exact ignition source has never been pinned down with absolute certainty. The Hindenburg is one of those disasters where modern people, armed with extraordinary hindsight, still have to live with ambiguity. And yet, even without perfect certainty, the effect was immediate and enormous. Public confidence in giant passenger airships collapsed almost overnight. That part is important because trust is often more fragile than technology. The Graf Zeppelin had flown safely for huge distances. The Hindenburg itself had completed many flights without any incident. But one widely filmed catastrophe, one unforgettable recording, one image of a giant luxury vessel collapsing in flames, and the airship era was effectively over. It did not matter that planes of the era were cramped, noisy, and far less comfortable. It did not matter that airships still had a certain advantages. The public had seen too much, too vividly. In Germany, the response was more muted than in the United States. News coverage was restrained. Memorializations resembled the treatment of war dead. Grassroots efforts to fund new Zeppelin construction were discouraged. And there's something darkly fitting about that. In America, the Hindenburg became a symbol of spectacular failure. In Germany, it had to be folded into a different kind of silence. Same fire, different memory. If you step back, what makes the Hindenburg so enduring is not just that it exploded or burned or killed, it's that it marked the end of a dream that looked astonishingly plausible right up until it failed. For a while, crossing the Atlantic in a floating hotel had not seemed ridiculous. It had seemed glamorous, viable, advanced. The Hindenburg was not a relic when it flew. It was a promise. And then, in less than a minute, that promise had become a warning. So maybe that's why the story still grips people even now. Not because it was merely disastrous, but because it was the destruction of the confidence itself. A machine that represented comfort, status, and modern engineering did not simply malfunction. It burned right in front of the world, and the world decided it had seen enough. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I really do want to see your answers in the comments. Do you think the Hindenburg ended the airship age because of the number of lives lost, or because the disaster was captured so powerfully that it destroyed public faith faster than any investigation ever could? And of course, as usual, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. History happens, so you never miss an episode.